This is from Time Magazine on September 13th. Across the U.S., more children and teens are being caught in the crossfire in crime. But this is how they finish the sentence, just interestingly. Are being caught in the crossfire, a byproduct of gun violence. Do you mean criminals? Is that what you mean? A byproduct of criminals. It's like the guns got up out of their cases, went out to the streets of Chicago and fired themselves. A byproduct of gun violence that has been exacerbated by the pandemic. Again, do you mean criminals with too much time on their hands? Is that what you're trying to say? They're talking to emergency room physicians and so on. Gunshot injuries at pediatric trauma centers spiked 50% across Houston, 300% in Hartford, Connecticut. Down in Fort Worth, they're up as well, up to record numbers. In Memphis, they're talking about the number of shooting victims, record highs. Some experts attribute the rise in violence to pandemic-related school closures and unemployment. Strains in emotional and mental health have led to poor conflict resolution and so on. We're not supposed to care about any of those effects of the pandemic. They don't count. Those that led to dead kids, those don't count. The only ones that count are the deaths. If you happen to have COVID, you don't even have to die of COVID. If you happen to die and you have COVID at the same time, those count. And I'm telling you, I'm getting angry because the crime, having just moved from New York, is out of control. The number of shootings, and what I get instead of honesty is opinion pieces like we saw from NBC and like some report from Democratic Party aligned think tank Third Way saying, oh, there's a hysteria about crime waves, suggesting there isn't. And there is.
Wow.
There's absolutely a crime wave, and NBC News is putting out falsehoods.
Just downplaying it. That's unbelievable because it's not even debatable that crime is up. That's the question is why. I mean,
they're focused on robberies. They're like, oh, in-home burglaries are down because everybody's home, but they're ignoring murders and shootings.
Yeah, I mean, it's awful. And here's something interesting. I live in rural Ohio, and there's more guns here than people, and we don't have shootings. No, nobody gets shot here. And if there is a shooting, it's once in a great blue moon. It just doesn't happen. But there's guns all over the place. Everybody has guns around here. So to come and say that, well, it was coupled with firearms and the pandemic, and say that's
gun
what
violence
caused it. Yeah, there's gun violence, guys. No, then why aren't the places with the most guns having the same rise in crime? No, we're talking about cultural issues. It's a cultural problem. I've been keeping a list. I haven't tracked all of the inner city violence, but I keep a list of the kids who are killed in inner city violence, kids who are under the age of 13, so 13 and younger. And last year there were 78, and this year so far there's been 55. And this is all over the country, mostly in like places like Chicago. Of course, we talk about Chicago all the time, but I mean, these kids are mostly victims of like stray bullets. So, and that's not even including kids who were just shot and recovered. Then we're talking about hundreds. And then once you expand that to under 18, then we're talking multiple hundreds. We're talking about like 500-600 kids that are being killed in street violence. And so that's just kids. That's not even looking at the adults, in which you get up to like 7,000 plus, 7,500. And so to ignore this problem and to just downplay it and say, oh, it's just hysteria. Whereas, we look at COVID deaths, kids in those neighborhoods are much more likely to be killed by some other guy with a gun than they are to die from COVID. But we're ignoring it, and so it's crazy.
Even to bring it up is considered controversial. Meanwhile, here to your point, and I know I appreciate the running list you've been keeping because no one seems to care about these kids who die on the receiving end of a gang member's bullet. In Baltimore, stray bullets have injured a 5-year-old sitting in his bathtub, a 10-year-old buying a bag of Cheetos earlier this year. And nearly half of all murders in Baltimore took place in the daytime in 2020. In the daytime. So the criminals are getting more brazen, more bold. And as our little ones get shot in their bathtubs, I just, how is it not on the nightly news every night? How is it not the lead? We've grown totally immune to inner city violence. I know you've said there's something called, this is your term, hood culture, that we seem totally unwilling to call out.
Yeah, and I'm not suggesting that we dwell all the time on tragedy and just depress ourselves, because I just keeping that list it's weighed heavily on me. Yeah, and I try to update it maybe once a week. And I don't mean to be trite about it, because obviously the people that are dealing with that stuff directly, obviously that's much more horrible for them. And I don't mean to like compare myself to them, but to say, but dwelling on that, it weighs on you. But still, to ignore it completely, that's just outrageous. And to say that like you said, the kid that was shot in his bathtub, or Jaslyn Adams that was shot in
Mm-hmm.
Chicago in a McDonald's drive-through, like she was in a drive-through with her dad, getting a Happy Meal, and somebody started shooting into their car and ended up killing her. And there's all kinds of stories that kids out playing in their yard or sleeping in their bed, babies in strollers getting shot because these people are just shooting indiscriminately into crowds and then not caring who they hit. And I heard a detective say one time that the ideology behind it is that they know where their target is, and they know uh, that if they just shoot indiscriminately, they're going to hit somebody that they care about. They may not get them specifically, but they're going to hit somebody else that they care about.
Oh my
And that's why they go
gosh.
shoot up funerals and birthday parties and things. I mean, it's just the lack of humanity is incredible. And it's unbelievable that we're not talking about it, at least on a cursory level, just to say, oh my gosh, this is happening. The only reason I began keeping that list, and I'm embarrassed to admit it. Like the only reason I started keeping that list last year was because of so many kids were killed on July 4th. And I realized how big of a problem it was, and I didn't know it. I didn't know how bad it was.
Mm-hmm.
And I started doing the research to see how many kids were being killed, and it just blew me away. And I was like, somebody has to put this out there, especially with all the stuff going around about how many unarmed Black people are killed by police and how awful that was. Because I think last year it was like 12 or 13 or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
And then you have 78 kids who are killed in street violence, and nothing. There's nothing. No national news, no outrage, no talk about we need to change the culture. Nothing.
Mm-hmm. Well, and
And
you
like,
talk about this. You talk about how this isn't necessarily a black white thing. Hood, this so-called
no, it's
quote
not.
hood culture, it can be white, it can be Latino, it can be black. The point is, why aren't we taking a hard look at these crime rates and trying to help the little 5-year-olds in their bathtub so they don't have to live like this?
Right. There's no kids should have to live like that. Not in America. This is not our country. We should not have little kids being shot in bathtubs because somebody shot through their apartment wall or their house or whatever it may be. And yeah, it is cultural at its root, and it's not racial. And I try to explain that to people pretty often, that a lot of times we like to conflate race and culture. And particularly you think about hood culture and you say, oh, like, well, you're criticizing Black people. No, no, I'm not. I'm criticizing a certain segment of our society that lends itself to this violent behavior. And that's not a racial thing, because there's white people involved with that. There's Black people, like you said, there's Latino people, there's Asian people. It's all across the spectrum. People who adhere to these ghetto hood values, this lack of respect for authority, this dismissal of education, this external locus of control, this idea that things happen to you instead of you being in control of your own life. No sense of personal responsibility, promiscuity. I mean, all of these things are indicative of a toxic culture that runs rampant through our inner cities. And that's what needs to be addressed. That's why crime rates are going up. And, that coupled with pulling back our police and not allowing them to do their jobs, and the whole defund the police movement. I mean, these are the things that need to be addressed. And if we really care about saving lives, that's where we would put our focus, Megyn.